There are many images and motifs that everyone recognizes. They're imprinted in our minds like a kind of mental library. You don't have to visit London to know what Big Ben looks like. You don't have to go to Louvre to recognize the Mona Lisa smile. And even if you've never been to Rome or opened a book on art, you're still familiar with these two hands. This image itself has inspired countless imitations, like the famous poster for Steven Spielberg's E.T. It's only natural to think that no one would use it or remember it if it didn't stir something within us. So the question is, why? What is it in this image painted over 500 years ago that still moves us today? (1508) Italy has been embroiled in the Italian wars for several years now, with France and Spain primarily vying for control of the country. Its minor states fought against each other, tearing country apart. Pope Julius II is actively involved in the country's fate. Hot-tempered and ambitious, he seeks to restore the Papal States to their former glory. As a patron of the arts, he employs not only troops but also artists to gain prestige for the Vatican and for himself. After proposing the grand idea of building a new St. Peter's Basilica, he commissioned one artist to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That artist was Michelangelo Buonarroti. In 1508, Michelangelo was just 30 years old, but he was already a superstar. His statue of David stood proudly in Florence, and he was regarded as a genius on par with Leonardo da Vinci. The Sistine Chapel, named after Pope Sixtus IV, is not just any chapel in Rome. Completed in 1481, it serves as the church for senior members of the Vatican. This is where they assemble and, most importantly, where they elect a new pope. You've likely seen it depicted in TV shows or films, from the young pope to conclave. The walls of the chapel had already been decorated by the most famous painters of the previous generation: Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Botticelli. So you'd think it would be flattering for a young artist to be commissioned to paint the ceiling of such an important place. Surely he must have been thrilled to work in a place where these great names had left their mark. But no. He wasn't happy, thrilled, or flattered at all. You see, this wasn't the first time when the Pope had summoned him to work, and none of the previous experiences had gone well. At first, Pope Julius II wanted Michelangelo to design for him a magnificent tomb. This was something Michelangelo was genuinely excited about. He traveled to the famous marble quarries in Carrara, selecting blocks of marble he could transform into statues, so magnificent that the world had never seen anything like this before. But the Pope's enthusiasm shifted from the tomb to another project, the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica. And so Michelangelo was left with no money to continue his work. Michelangelo was never known for his calm temperament, so you can imagine how furious he was. He also suspected an intrigue against him, particularly by Bramante, the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica, whom he feared wanted to poison him. The artist wrote a rude letter to the Pope, stating that if the Pope wanted him, he could come and find him. Then he left for Florence. Michelangelo was bad-tempered, and Pope Julius II was no better, so everyone feared that this conflict will not end well. Julius ordered Michelangelo to return. He refused. Eventually, the Florentine government, fearing war with the Pope over Michelangelo, urged him to comply. Michelangelo resisted, but finally the head of the city of Florence persuaded him to go. At the time, the Pope was stationed with his army in Bologna. There, Michelangelo received yet another assignment. Instead of resuming work on the tomb, he was tasked with creating a bronze statue of Julius. Michelangelo initially refused, but was ultimately forced to concede. The statue would be destroyed 3 years later. By 1508, Michelangelo returned to Rome. Once again, rather than resuming work on the tomb, he was given a new commission: painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. His response, as you might expect, was no. He saw himself as a sculptor, not a painter, and did everything he could to avoid the task. He was convinced the commission was part of an intrigue by his enemies. But, as before, he had no choice, and so he began to work. The chapel resembles a very large assembly hall with a shallow vaulted ceiling. Julius II originally wanted to place 12 apostles on the ceiling, but Michelangelo, true to form, disagreed. It was far too few for him. You'll recall that with the tomb, he aimed to create something the world had never seen. For someone with that level of ambition, 12 apostles simply weren't enough. And this time Michelangelo was determined not to compromise. After some heated arguments, the Pope finally said, "Do what you like." What a joy that must have been for Michelangelo to hear. He brought in assistants from Florence, but ultimately assigned them only minor tasks. Michelangelo then shut himself in the chapel and spent 4 years working alone on the ceiling. My beard toward heaven, I feel the back of my brain, my brush upon my face continually, makes it a splendid floor by dripping down. I have no friends of any kind, and don't want any. When you walk into the chapel, you'll see paintings on the walls in the traditional style of Michelangelo's predecessors, depicting stories of Moses and Christ. But when you look up, you'll see something entirely different, like stepping into another world. It's hard to imagine how one man could accomplish such an enormous amount of work alone. Most would say it's impossible, but Michelangelo proved them wrong. Michelangelo painted over 1,000 square meters of plaster. He brought to life scenes from the Old Testament, the story of the creation of the world, Noah, the prophets, Christ's ancestors, classical symbols, and countless unnamed figures, many of which look more like sculptures than painted images. There is no imbalance. Despite the sheer number of figures, the ceiling appears harmonious. Yet another astonishing achievement, especially considering he worked alone. At the center of all these breathtaking stories, bodies, and characters, we find the iconic image, the creation of Adam. Both figures are products of the Renaissance, not just in their representation, but in their underlying ideas. If you compare Middle Ages depictions of God and Adam, you'll notice something entirely different. Adam and Eve had disobeyed God, and so their guilt was passed on to all their descendants. People saw themselves as sinners, and so art reflected this belief. Painters of the Middle Ages depicted heaven in bright splendor, while humans were portrayed below, small and wretched. Adam and Eve were often shown in the same way, naked and ashamed. The Renaissance, however, brought a dramatic shift. Artists introduced a new vision of humankind, as seen with Adam and Eve. Instead of disgraceful sinners cast out of paradise, they were now imagined as God's creations in their original state, beautiful and perfect. Michelangelo's Adam is the embodiment of perfection. Though newly created, he already has athletic shoulders and defined muscles. You would never see such a figure in medieval art, where the human form was more about symbol than likeness. This shift was further influenced by the rediscovery of classical art. At the time, the sovereign individual was celebrated, and any noble character was expected to possess a beautiful body. In Michelangelo's era, the goal was to merge classical with Christian thought, a vision of man as both a beautiful and perfect creation. Michelangelo depicts Adam as beautiful, noble, perfect, and created in the image of God. As written in Genesis, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. The head and body of God are rendered with the same level of detail as Adam's. In doing so, Michelangelo gave both God and man the same material substance. The only difference lies in their age. Regarding the image of God, although the Bible states that God is beyond human imagination, Christians have long sought to visualize him. Traditionally, he was depicted symbolically as a bearded, venerable old man. This changed with the Renaissance. Michelangelo gave us not only the visage but also the body of God. For inspiration, he turned to classical antiquity. If you compare the image of Zeus with Michelangelo's God, the similarities are striking. Even God's movement echoes the ever-active Zeus, who was said to move between Olympus and the human world, hurling thunderbolts. Here, too, God approaches Adam with great speed, emerging from the cosmos, while Adam remains still. The entire composition is built around a single powerful gesture, the moment when God and Adam almost touch hands. So what is this gesture? According to Genesis, there were two phases in the creation of Adam. First, he was formed from the dust of the ground. Second, God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. During the Middle Ages, painters almost always depicted the first phase. Typically, God, portrayed as an old man, was shown bending over a lying or seated Adam. As for the second phase, the act of breathing divine life was usually conveyed by golden rays or small winged figures. In medieval art, there was no issue visualizing something in a highly conventional way. However, this second phase disappeared with the Renaissance. The likely reason is that it was difficult to connect this divine act with more realistic artistic outlook of the new era. Additionally, the act of blowing into someone's nose may have been seen as indecorous. Michelangelo visualized many groundbreaking ideas on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but nothing he created was as radical or impressive as this. He reimagined the act of the invisible breath, capturing the moment just before God touches man, their fingertips almost meeting, the instant before they connect. But this detail became so iconic not because Michelangelo invented a new way to depict a biblical act 500 years ago, nor because of its beauty, colors, shapes, or convincing naturalism. Its power lies in how it resonates with us, evoking something beyond art. It stirs questions we may fear to confront or even deny. Where did we all come from? Was there a great power that created this perfect Adam and all of us? And can we sense this divine power within ourselves? It also might stir other needs in the viewer, like the need for guidance. Adam sits shyly and tenderly, alone in this world. He doesn't move. Meanwhile, God, with his beard, hair and clothes swept backward by an air stream, is surrounded by his companions as he flies and reaches toward Adam. God's movement, his touch, promises Adam and all of humankind salvation. You are not alone. It offers us guidance in this strange, sometimes terrifying world. It gives us hope and the image of a paternal hand reaching out to us in times of need. Here, God is not the fierce creator who condemns humankind as guilty from birth or threatens destruction, nor is he above Adam. Michelangelo shows him floating almost at the same height as Adam. He is more like a father to his creation. And if we go back to the ET poster that replicates this gesture, it no longer has anything to do with the Bible or religiosity. This visual form, created by Michelangelo, continued to resonate far beyond its time and the walls of the chapel, touching entirely different aspects of human life. Michelangelo was trained like any other craftsman. At 13, he was apprenticed to the workshop of one of the leading masters of the time, the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. However, as far as we know, Michelangelo didn't enjoy his time in this successful painter's workshop. Ghirlandaio was a master of his craft, very skilled, in fact. He knew how to tell sacred stories in an appealing way, arrange his figures effectively, and, in short, create works that pleased the eye. But Michelangelo's ideas about art were different. He began studying the works of great masters of the past, such as Giotto, Donatello, and the ancient sculptors of Greece and Rome. He was particularly fascinated by how these sculptors managed to represent the human body in all its beauty and motion. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo conducted his own research on human anatomy. But unlike Leonardo, who was curious about many of the world's mysteries, Michelangelo displayed extraordinary focus on mastering a single problem: how to represent the human figure in all its variations. Before long, there was no movement or posture too challenging for him to draw. In fact, difficulty seemed to attract him. His skill and knowledge quickly elevated him to the status of one of the outstanding masters of his age. But more importantly, they transformed him from a mere craftsman into an artist. Michelangelo was trained like any other craftsman because, since Aristotle's time, painters were considered more like craftsmen than artists. The prevailing logic was that if you worked with your hands, your job was manual labor and couldn't be placed on the same level as that of a poet, for instance. During the Renaissance, learned scholars and patrons, along with the artists themselves, debated on the subject. Over his long life, Michelangelo witnessed a complete shift in the social status of artists. To some extent, he himself brought about this change. Michelangelo, alongside the names as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Titian, contributed to this change with his work. Thanks to them, we now think about artists as creators, not just craftsmen. The image of God in the Sistine Chapel was modeled not only on classical antiquity, particularly Zeus, but also, as some portraits suggest, on Michelangelo himself. By achieving what seemed impossible for one person to create, Michelangelo seemed to prove that he, like Adam, not only had the touch of God, he, as an artist, became a creator in his own right. But what about this little space? In 1486, Pico della Mirandola, a prodigy of rhetoric and learning, declared that man is the most fortunate of all creatures and the most worthy of admiration. He explained that God placed limits on all his creations except for man, making man almost as free as God himself, with a divinity clothed in flesh residing in each individual. But Mirandola also said that man, being almost as free as God, could descend into the lower forms of life, the beasts, or ascend into the higher forms, the divine. So if you're free, then there's a choice to make. Maybe this is why Michelangelo showed us this little gap between God and Adam. God hasn't touched him yet, because this choice is up to him.